Chapter 5, the Integumentary System. An achy mosquito bite, a painful sunburn, a really good hair day. Despite its unfamiliar name, the integumentary system is an organ system that is very familiar to us. This system includes structures we can see, the skin, the hair, and the nails. Parts of the system we cannot see are glands such as sweat glands, the sensory receptors, and the subcutaneous tissue below the skin. An integument is a covering. The integumentary system covers the body and is a barrier between the external environment and internal environment of the body. The skin is made of several different tissue types and is considered an organ. In part non-living, the skin prevents the entry of many harmful substances. The living parts of the skin have several different roles in the maintenance of homeostasis. The subcutaneous tissue directly underneath the skin connects it to the muscles and has other functions as well. The skin. The two major layers of the skin are the outer epidermis and the inner dermis. Each of these layers is made of different tissues and has very different functions. Epidermis. The epidermis is made of stratified squamous keratinizing epithelial tissue and is the thickest of the palms of the hands and soles of the feet. The cells that are most abundant are called keratinocytes, and there are no capillaries present between them. Rather, the keratinocytes are bound to one another in what are called tight junctions made of proteins of their cell membranes. In parentheses, picture sheets of flat cells all zippered together along their sides, close parentheses. Although the epidermis may be further subdivided into 4 or 5 sublayers, 2 of these are of greatest importance. The innermost layer, the stratum germinativum, and the outermost layer, the stratum corneum. Stratum germinativum. The stratum germinativum may also be called the stratum basal. Each name tells us something about this layer. To germinate means to sprout or grow. Basal means the base or the lowest part. The stratum germinativum is the base of the epidermis, the innermost layer in which mitosis takes place. New cells are continually being produced, pushing the older cells toward the skin surface. These cells produce the protein keratin, and as they get further away from the capillaries in the dermis, they die. As dead cells are worn off the skin surface, they are replaced by cells from the lower layers. Scattered among the keratinocytes of the stratum germinativum are very different cells called Merkel cells or Merkel disc. These are receptors for the sense of touch. The living keratinocytes are able to synthesize antimicrobial peptides called defensins. These and other chemicals are produced following the injury to the skin as part of the process of inflammation. Defensins rupture the membranes of pathogens such as bacteria that may enter by way of breaks in the skin. The living portion of the epidermis also produce a vitamin. The cells have a form of cholesterol that on exposure to ultraviolet light is changed to vitamin D. A form then modified by the liver and converted by the kidneys to its most active form called 1,25-D or calcitrol, which is considered a hormone, close parentheses. This is why vitamin D is sometimes referred to as the sunshine vitamin. People who do not get much sunshine depend more on nutritional sources of vitamin D, such as fortified milk. But sunlight is probably the best way to get vitamin D, and 15 minutes a day, a few times a week is often enough. Excess vitamin D is stored in the liver. In parentheses, vitamin D is fat soluble, and if taken in excessive amounts can become toxic, close parentheses. Vitamin D is important for the absorption of calcium and phosphorus from food in the small intestine. And these minerals are used to build the matrix of bones and teeth. This function has been known for years. Recent research indicates that vitamin D also contributes to other important body processes. It is involved in maintaining muscle strength, especially in elderly people, and in the functioning of insulin for the regulation of blood glucose level. Despite recent claims in popular media, studies of large populations seem to indicate that vitamin D does not provide protection against colon cancer, and its possible effects on other types of cancer has not been as thoroughly studied as yet. More likely is that vitamin D may provide protection against infections caused by certain bacteria or viruses. For example, people with a vitamin D deficiency seem more susceptible to tuberculosis, in parentheses, bacterial, and influenza, in parentheses, viral, close parentheses. Vitamin D stimulates the skin cells and white blood cells to produce cathelicidin, a natural antimicrobial that punctures the membranes or outer coverings of pathogens. We still have much to learn about this vitamin. Stratum corneum. The stratum corneum, the outermost epidermal layer, consists of many layers of dead cells. All that is left is their keratin. The protein keratin is relatively waterproof, and through the stratum corneum should not be thought, and though the stratum corneum should not be thought of as a plastic bag encasing the body, it does prevent most evaporation of body water. Also of importance, keratin prevents the entry of water. Without a waterproof stratum corneum, it would be impossible to swim in a pool or even take a shower without damaging our cells. The stratum corneum is also a barrier to chemicals and pathogens. Most chemicals, unless they are corrosive, like acids, will not get through unbroken skin to the living tissue within. One painful exception is the sap of poison ivy. This resin does penetrate the skin and initiate an allergic reaction in susceptible people. The welts we call hives are an inflammatory response characteristic of allergies. The hives of poison ivy become blisters and itch severely. Recall from chapter 1 that our skin surface is a microbiome, an environment for the bacteria we call our microbiota, or normal flora. Hundreds of species of bacteria and many types of fungi make their home on the surface of skin. They are not harmful as long as they remain outside the body. An intact stratum cornea helps keep them outside, as do the tight junctions between keratinocytes. Most bacteria and other microorganisms cannot penetrate unbroken skin. The epidermis contributes passively to keeping the microbial population in check, in that the flaking of dead cells from the skin surface helps remove microorganisms. The importance of the stratum corneum becomes especially apparent when it is lost. Certain minor changes in the epidermis are undoubtedly familiar to you. When a person wears new shoes, for example, the skin of the foot may be subjected to friction. This will separate layers of the epidermis or separate the epidermis from the dermis, and tissue fluid may collect, causing a blister. If the skin is subjected to pressure, the rate of mitosis in the stratum germinativum will increase and create a thicker epidermis. We call this a callus. Although calluses are more common on the palms and soles, they may occur on any part of the skin. Also familiar to you on the palms and soles are what we call prints. The ridges of the epidermal junction with the dermis are most apparent as fingertips and footprints. The function of these whorls and loops and lines is not known with certainty. Some biologists suggest that prints help with gripping. Others propose that prints make fingertips more sensitive to the texture of objects. Although each person's fingertips are unique, they are not unchangeable. As we age, our epidermal ridges become less distinct and new lines or wrinkles form on the fingertip surfaces. Langerhans cells. Within the epidermis are Langerhans cells, which are also called dendritic cells because of their branched appearance when they move. These cells originate in the red bone marrow and are quite mobile. They are able to phagocytize foreign materials, such as bacteria that enter the body through breaks in the skin. With such ingested pathogens, the Langerhans cells migrate to lymph nodes and present the pathogen to lymphocytes, a type of white blood cell. This triggers an immune response, such as the production of antibodies. In parentheses, antibodies are proteins that label foreign material for destruction. Close parentheses. Because the skin is positioned adjacent to the external environment, it is an important component of the body's protective responses through many of the exact aspects of this, though many of the exact aspects of this have yet to be determined. Langerhans cells are part of innate, in parentheses, inborn, close parentheses, immune mechanisms and our most rapid response to pathogens, in parentheses. Immunity is covered in detail in chapter 14. Melanocytes, another type of cell found in the lower epidermis, is the melanocyte, which is also shown in figure 5.2. Melanocytes produce a pigment called melanin, which is made primarily from the amino acid tyrosine. People of the same size have approximately the same number of melanocytes, though these cells may differ in their level of activity. In people with dark skin, the melanocytes continuously produce large amounts of melanin. The melanocytes of light-skinned people produce less melanin. The activity of melanocytes is genetically regulated. Skin color is one of our hereditary characteristics. In all people, melanin production is increased by exposure of the skin to ultraviolet rays, which are a part of sunlight and are damaging to living cells. As more melanin is produced, it is taken in by the epidermal cells as they are pushed toward the surface. This gives the skin a darker color, which acts as a barrier and reduces exposure in the living stratum, germinativum, and the roaming Langerhans cells to ultraviolet rays. People with light skin do not have much natural protection against ultraviolet rays, and exposure to sun will tan the epidermis and form a temporary shield. People with dark skin already have good protection against the damaging effects of ultraviolet rays, but unfortunately, they produce less vitamin D. Melanin also gives color to hair, though its protective function is confined to the hair of the head. Two parts of the eye obtain their color from melanin: the iris and the anterior choroid layer of the eyeball. The function of the epidermis and its cells are summarized in Table 5.1. Takeaways. 1. With respect to the epidermis, describe the location and explain the purpose of mitosis. 2. Where in the skin is vitamin D produced? From what is it produced and when? 3. What kind of chemical is keratin and where and why is it important? Dermis. The dermis is made of an irregular type of fibrous connective tissue. Irregular meaning that the fibers are not parallel but crisscross and run in all directions. Fibroblasts produce both collagen and elastin fibers. Recall that collagen fibers are strong and elastin fibers are able to recoil after being stretched. Strength and elasticity are two characteristics of the dermis. With increasing age, however, the deterioration of the elastin fibers causes the skin to lose its elasticity. We can all look forward to at least a few wrinkles as we get older. The uneven junction of the dermis with the epidermis is called the papillary layer. Capillaries are abundant here to nourish not only the dermis, but also the stratum germinativum. The epidermis has no capillaries of its own, and the lower living cells depend on the blood supply in the dermis for oxygen and nutrients. Within the dermis are the accessory skin structures, hair and nail follicles, sensory receptors, and several types of glands. Some of these structures project through the epidermis to the skin surface, but their active portions are in the dermis. Hair follicles. Hair follicles are made of epidermal tissue, and the growth process of hair is very similar to the growth of the epidermis. At the base of the follicle is the dermal papilla, a projection of connective tissue of the dermis. It contains blood vessels. Just above the dermal papilla is the hair root, which contains cells called the matrix, where mitosis takes place. The new cells produce keratin, get their color from melanin, and then die and become incorporated into their hair shaft, which is pushed toward the surface of the skin. The hair that we comb and brush every day consists of dead keratinized cells. The monthly rate of hair growth averages 0.3 to 0.4 inches, 8 to 10 millimeters, and eventually a hair follicle will become dormant before starting to grow a new hair that pushes the old hair out. We lose hair from the scalp every day. Estimates range from 50 to 100 hairs lost per day. Compared with some other mammals, humans do not have very much hair. The actual functions of human hair are few. Eyelashes and eyebrows help to keep dust and perspiration out of the eyes, and the hairs just inside the nostrils help to keep dust out of the nasal cavities. Hair of the scalp does provide insulation from the cold for the head. The hair on our bodies, however, no longer serves this function, but we have the evolutionary remnants of it. Attached to each hair follicle is a small, smooth muscle called the pilomotor or erector pili muscle, which, when stimulated by cold or emotions such as fear, these muscles pull the hair follicles upright. Piloerection. For an animal with fur, this would trap air and provide greater insulation from cold or make the animal appear larger, perhaps to deter a possible predator. Because people do have thick fur, all this reaction does is give us goosebumps. Loss of hair is called alopecia and may have any of several causes. Nail follicles. Found on the end of fingers and toes, nail follicles produce nails just as hair follicles produce hair. Mitosis takes place in the nail root at the base of the nail, and the new cells produce keratin and then die. Although the nail itself consists of keratinized dead cells, the flat nail bed is living epidermis and dermis. This is why cutting a nail too short can be quite painful. Nails protect the ends of the fingers and toes from mechanical injury and give the fingers greater ability to pick up small objects. Fingernails are also good for scratching. This is more important than it may seem at first. An itch might mean the presence of an arthropod parasite, a mosquito, tick, flea, or louse. These parasites, in parentheses, all but the tick, are insects, close parentheses, feed on blood, and are all potential vectors of diseases caused by bacteria, viruses, or protozoa. A quick and vigorous scratch may kill or at least dislodge the arthropod and prevent the transmission of the disease. Fingernails grow at a monthly rate of about 3 millimeters, and growth is a little faster during the summer months. Receptors. Most sensory receptors for the cutaneous senses are found in the dermis. In parentheses, Merkel cells are the stratum germinativum, as are some nerve endings. Close parentheses. The cutaneous Merkel cells are in the stratum germinativum, as are some nerve endings. The cutaneous senses are touch, pressure, heat, cold, itch, and pain. For each sensation, there is a specific type of receptor, which is a structure that will detect a particular change. For heat, cold, itch, and pain, the receptors are free nerve endings. For touch and pressure, the receptors are called encapsulated nerve endings, which means there is a cellular structure around the sensory nerve ending. The purpose of the impulses generated by these receptors is to enable the brain to create a sensation, a picture of what is going on in the external environment and its effect on the skin. This sensation, or melding of several sensations, may stimulate responses such as washing a painful cut finger, scratching an insect bite, or responding to a feeling of cold by putting on a sweater. The sensitivity of an area of skin is determined by how many receptors are present. That is, the spatial density of the receptors. Think for a moment of the density of buildings and houses in a city compared with the spacing of farmhouses and barns in the countryside. If a meteorite were to fall on a city, it would very likely strike a house. But if it fell in the countryside, the meteorite would likely strike between the houses. The skin of the fingertips is like the city in that it is very sensitive to touch because there are many receptors per square inch. The skin of the upper arm, with few touch receptors per square inch, is more like the countryside and is less sensitive. As mentioned, when receptors detect changes, they generate nerve impulses that are carried by sensory nerves to the brain. The brain then interprets the impulses as a particular sensation. Sensation, therefore, is actually a function of the brain, as we will return to this and other aspects of sensation in chapter 8 and 9. Glands. Glands are made of epithelial tissue. The eccrine glands of the skin have their secretory portions in the dermis. Some of these are shown in figure 5.1. Sebaceous gland. The ducts of sebaceous glands open into hair follicles or directly to the skin surface. Their secretion is sebum, a liquid substance that we commonly refer to as oil. The fatty acids of sebum inhibit the growth of some species of bacteria, not all, on the skin surface, preventing colonization, the rapid growth of large numbers. Another function of sebum is to prevent the drying out of skin and hair. The importance of this may be readily apparent, but skin that is dry tends to crack more easily. Even very small breaks in the skin are potential entryways for bacteria. Decreased sebum production is another consequence of getting older, and elderly people often have dry and more fragile skin. Adolescents may have the problem of overactive sebaceous glands and the inflammatory condition called acne. Too much sebum may trap bacteria within hair follicles and create small infections. Because sebaceous glands are more numerous around the nose and mouth, these are common sites of pimples in young people. Ceruminous glands. These glands are located in the dermis of the ear canals. Their secretion is called cerumen, or earwax, in parentheses, which includes the sebum secreted in the ear canals, close parentheses. Cerumen keeps the outer surface of the eardrum pliable and prevents drying. However, if excessive cerumen accumulates in the ear canal, it may become impacted against the eardrum. This might diminish the acuity of hearing by preventing the acuity of hearing by preventing the eardrum from vibrating properly. Sweat glands. There are two types of sweat glands, apocrine and eccrine. Sweat is mostly water. It is made from blood plasma and is salty, which with a similar amount of sodium chloride. Also found in sweat are very small amounts of the hundreds of other chemicals that may be transported by the blood. Some of these chemicals are simple, such as amino acids, and others more complex, many of them volatile, meaning that they readily evaporate at moderate temperatures. Each individual produces a slightly different combination of these chemicals, which gives each person a unique scent. Animals such as dogs can easily distinguish among people, in parentheses, even identical twins, close parentheses, because of their individual scent. Apocrine glands are most numerous in the axillae, underarm, close parentheses, and genital areas, and are most active in stressful and emotional situations. Although their secretion does have an odor, it is barely perceptible to other people. If the apocrine secretions are allowed to accumulate on the skin, however, bacteria metabolize the chemicals in the sweat and produce waste products that have distinct odors that many people find unpleasant. Eccrine glands are found all over the body, but are especially numerous on forehead, upper lip, palms, and soles. The secretory portion of these glands is simply a coiled tube in the dermis. The duct of this tube extends to the skin's surface where it opens into a pore. The sweat produced by eccrine glands is important in the maintenance of normal body temperature. In a warm environment or during exercise, more sweat is secreted onto the skin surface where it is then evaporated by excess body heat. Recall that water has a high heat of vaporization, which means that a great deal of heat can be lost in the evaporation of a relatively small amount of water. Although this is a very effective mechanism of heat loss, it has potentially serious disadvantages. Loss of too many body water in sweat may lead to dehydration, especially after exercise on a hot and humid day. Increased sweating during exercise or on warm days should always be accompanied by increased fluid intake and without waiting for the sensation of thirst. Those who exercise usually know that they must replace salt as well as water. Sodium chloride is also lost in salt, as are small amounts of urea, in parentheses, a nitrogenous waste product of amino acid metabolism, close parentheses. This excretory function of the skin is very minor. However, the kidneys are primarily responsible for removing waste products from the blood and for maintaining the body's proper salt to water proportion. Blood vessels. Besides the capillaries in the dermis, the other blood vessels of great importance are the arterioles. Arterioles are small arteries, and the smooth muscle in the walls permits them to constrict, close, or dilate open. This is important in the maintenance of body temperature because blood carries heat, which is a form of energy. In a warm environment, the arterioles dilate, vasodilation, in parentheses, close parentheses, which increases blood flow through the dermis and brings excess heat close to the body surface to be radiated to the environment. In a cold environment, however, body heat must be conserved if possible. So the arterioles constrict, in parentheses, to remember, think cold, constrict, conserve, close parentheses. This vasoconstriction decreases the flow of blood through the dermis and helps keep heat within the core of the body. This adjusting mechanism is essential for maintaining homeostasis. Regulation of the diameter of the arterioles in response to external temperature changes is controlled by the nervous system. These changes can often be seen in light-skinned people. Flushing, especially in the face, may be observed in hot weather. In cold, the skin of the extremities may become even paler as blood flow through the dermis decreases. In people with dark skin, such changes are not as readily apparent because the changes are masked by melanin in the epidermis. Vasoconstriction in the dermis may also occur during stressful situations. For our ancestors, stress usually demanded a physical response, either stand and fight or run away to try to reach a safe place. This is called the fight or flight response. Our nervous system are still programmed to respond as if physical activity were necessary to cope with the stress situation. Vasoconstriction in the dermis will shunt or redirect blood to more vital organs such as the muscles, heart, and brain. In times of stress, the skin is a relatively unimportant organ and can function temporarily with a minimal blood flow. You have probably heard the expression broke out in a cold sweat and may even have felt this way in stressful situations. Such sweating feels cold because vasoconstriction in the dermis makes the skin relatively cool. Blood flow in the dermis may be interrupted by prolonged pressure on the skin. For example, hospital patients who cannot turn over by themselves may develop decubitus ulcers, also called pressure ulcers or pressure sores. The skin is compressed between the object outside, such as a bed, and a bony prominence within, such as the heel bone or the sacrum in the lower back. Without its blood supply, the skin dies and the dead tissue is a potential site for bacterial infection. The functions of dermal structures are summarized in Table 5.2. Takeaways. 1. What type of blood vessels in the dermis help to regulate body temperature? What tissue do vessels have for this? If these blood vessels are dilated, what is the environmental temperature likely to be? 2. The dermis has both strength and stretchiness. What provides these characteristics? What do these substances have in common? 3. Receptors detect or receive changes. What kinds of changes do these receptors in the dermis detect? Subcutaneous tissue. The subcutaneous tissue may also be called the superficial fascia, one of the connective tissue membranes made of areolar connective tissue and adipose tissue. The superficial fascia connects the dermis to the underlying muscles. Its other functions are those of its tissues, as you may recall from chapter 4. Areolar connective tissue or loose connective tissue contains collagen and elastin fibers and many white blood cells. They have left capillaries to wander around in the tissue between skin and muscles. These migrating white blood cells destroy pathogens that enter the body through breaks in the skin. Also present are mast cells. These mast cells are produced in the red bone marrow and found in connective tissue throughout the body. They are especially numerous in areolar tissue, where they produce histamine, leukotrienes, and other chemicals that help bring about inflammation. The body's response to damage, in parentheses, inflammation, is described in chapter 10 and 14. The cells, adipocytes of adipose tissue, are specialized to store fat, and our subcutaneous layer of fat stores excess nutrients as a potential energy source. This layer also cushions bony prominences, such as those of the hip bones, during sitting, and provides some insulation from cold. For people, this last function is relatively minor because we do not have a thick layer of fat as do animals such as whales and seals. As mentioned in chapter 4, brown fat is a thermogenic tissue producing heat rather than storing fat, and becomes especially active if a person is exposed to cold. You may also recall from chapter 4 that adipose tissue is involved in the onset or cessation of eating and in the use of insulin by body cells, and it contributes to inflammation by producing cytokines, chemicals that activate white blood cells. Just as the epidermis forms a continuous sheet that covers the body, the subcutaneous tissue is a continuous layer, though it is internal. If we consider the epidermis as a first line of defense against pathogens, as we consider the subcutaneous tissue as a second line of defense, there is, however, a significant anatomic difference. The cells of the epidermis are very closely and tightly packed, but the cells and protein fibers of subcutaneous tissue are farther apart, and there is much more tissue fluid. If we imagine the epidermis as a 4-lane highway during rush hour traffic with bumper-to-bumper traffic, the superficial fascia would be that same highway at 3 o'clock in the morning, when it is not crowded and cars can move much faster. This is an obvious benefit for the migrating white blood cells, but may become a disadvantage because some bacteria pathogens, once established, can spread even more rapidly through subcutaneous tissue. Group A, Streptococcus, for example, is a cause of necrotizing fasciitis. Necrotizing means to cause death, and fasciitis is the inflammation of a fascia. In this case, the superficial fascia and the deep fascia around muscles. Necrotizing fasciitis is an acute infection in both meaning of acute, sudden onset, and extremely serious. It requires a surgical removal of the infected tissue or even amputation of an infected limb to try to stop the spread of the bacteria. The body's defenses have been overwhelmed because what is usually an anatomic benefit, The looseness of areolar connective tissue has become a detriment. The function of subcutaneous tissues are in Table 5.3. Administering medication, ways in which we give medication through the skin. Takeaways 3. 1. The subcutaneous layer provides for storage. Name the tissue involved and state what is stored. 2. The subcutaneous layer also provides for defense of the body. Name the tissue and the cells that help facilitate this. Aging and the integumentary system. The effects of age on both the integumentary system are often quite visible. Both layers of the skin become thinner and more fragile as mitosis in the epidermis slows and fibroblasts in the dermis die and are not replaced. Repair of even small breaks or cuts is slower. The skin becomes wrinkled as collagen and elastin fibers in the dermis deteriorate. Sebaceous glands and sweat glands become less active. The skin becomes dry and temperature regulation in hot weather becomes more difficult. Hair follicles become inactive and hair on the scalp and body thins. Baldness, loss of hair from the scalp is often genetically regulated. In parentheses, women and men may be affected, close parentheses. Melanocytes die and are not replaced. The hair that remains becomes white. The remaining melanocytes may not be enough to create an effective barrier of melanin, and the skin becomes more susceptible to sunburn. The ability to produce vitamin D decreases as much as 50% to 70%, and older people must rely more on diet for this essential nutrient. There is often less fat in the subcutaneous tissue, which make an elderly person more sensitive to cold. It is important for elderly people and those who care for them to realize that extremes to temperature may be harmful and to take special precautions in very hot or very cold weather. Summary: the integumentary system is the outermost organ system of the body. You have noticed that many of its functions are related to this location. The skin protects the body against pathogens and chemicals, minimizes loss or entry of water, blocks the harmful effects of sunlight, and produces vitamin D. The sensory receptors in the skin provide information about the external environment, and the skin helps regulate body temperature in response to environmental changes. The subcutaneous tissue is a secondary line of defense against pathogens and a site of fat storage and of the other metabolic functions of adipose tissue.